I never know how long to wait. Good morning, John Emerson of Seeking Light. Hope you're doing well today on this Tuesday morning. First day of the work week for many of us. Seems kind of odd. Of course, it is September 5th. Anyway, saw the news this morning that Jill Biden has COVID. So, of course, when anybody extremely prominent ends up with some kind of illness or disease or something, especially one that has been made so politically charged as COVID, it's going to make the news. Now, keep in mind that Jill Biden has probably had every single booster under the sun. I can't say that for sure, but it's very much a likelihood that she has had not only the original two, but to encourage people around her to continue to get this experimental drug. She's probably had every single booster. And I talked about the study the other day that indicated the vast superiority of natural immunity, which was a very well done and extremely large study done by Israel. The fact of the matter is, it's making the news in the United States that we're going to need a new booster that's going to be coming out. So I'm asking you to not generally believe the whole COVID cases are a cause of increasing hospitalizations because I truly believe it is a lie. And why do I say that? Well, one, we know from the first rounds of more virulent strains that the reason you ended up in the hospital was one, you were old and probably very nearing the average age of death for Americans if you ended up in the hospital. That was one. The second reason that you might end up in the hospital at a younger age, especially, is if you had four or more comorbidities. Now, what are comorbidities? They're diseases that you have that cause symptoms that can commingle, that can corroborate, that can work with other diseases that you have to cause really bad disease states. I'll give you an example. Diabetes predisposes one for arteriosclerosis and makes it much more likely that you're going to develop plaques, which of course can lead to heart disease. It can also lead to things like failure of your kidneys or your liver. So, in other words, diabetes causes a number of comorbidities, and all of these predispose you to having massive problems. One of the main reasons that people develop diabetes is obesity. And as we know from the previous pandemic and studies that were done, the number one cause of people having adverse events from COVID was obesity. Why? Because of the comorbidities that came along with it. So they're going to be telling you that the primary cause of people getting hospitalized is going to be COVID. But the fact of the matter is, it's just a precipitating event for somebody that already has some very significant disease states. So whether it was COVID or the flu or a hangnail, something threw the person over the edge. It was the straw that broke the camel's back that put them in the hospital, and that's what's going to be driving numbers. Now, you might remember from the first pandemic, and I think I highlighted this on my channel, but other people definitely highlighted this a lot more, is that the numbers for people hospitalized due to COVID was skewed and likely on purpose. How is it skewed, and why am I saying likely on purpose? Number one, it was skewed because people would show up at the hospital for some health event. And oh, by the way, they tested positive for COVID. It wasn't necessarily the COVID itself that drove them to the hospital, but it was this conglomeration of events going on in their life that put them in the hospital. And while they were there, they tested positive. And what ended up happening was, and this ended up making the news, that those diagnoses, primary diagnoses of COVID, were given to the patient. And here's the reason why. Number one, hospitals were financially incentivized to have the diagnosis of COVID. They were being paid during the heyday of the pandemic, which remember wasn't very long ago. They were paid extra for that diagnosis. It gave them access to more money, and the assumption was, of course, they would need more supplies. But if this COVID disease primary diagnosis wasn't that bad, they didn't need those supplies. Well, they made extra money. It padded their pockets. The other thing that helped by getting a primary diagnosis of COVID at that time was if you happened to die, you as a family would get multiple thousands. If I remember right, it was $9,000 extra as a death benefit for that person. Now, you think about it, people that don't have any insurance or didn't have any money set aside, $9,000 goes a long way towards paying for a burial. So, anyway, those are significant reasons why giving that primary diagnosis of COVID, which would then end up on the death certificate, would be very helpful. Would be a financial incentive to the families. So you had hospitals incentivized and you had families incentivized to have or press for COVID primary diagnosis. And now we're seeing headlines being made that COVID cases are on the rise. I'd like to see the raw data. Are the hospitals going to post that? Patient is here due to COVID. The other thing that one of the things that happened during COVID, this happened at my hospital, and it probably happened in a lot of other hospitals, was that you got cases were tracked by whether they were in the ICU or they were in general hospital population. Obviously, if your numbers are high in the ICU, and one of the narratives during the COVID pandemic was that we're tying up ICU beds, is that look how deadly this disease is, look how serious it is. It's taking up valuable resources for patients that could be in the ICU. And obviously there were cases, lots of cases of people with COVID in the ICU. But what I'd like to do is see that those numbers broken down at this point, because as I pointed out the other day, and this is documented very well in scientific literature, the current COVID infections or the current virus is vastly reduced in potency since the back in the day when it first came out. So we need to see those numbers. What is the percentage of people ending up in the ICU compared to general hospital population? And of course, compared to the general population of infections. And frankly, and another thing to think about too is how many people are actually getting tested at this point. A couple of years ago, if I got COVID, and a lot of people are in the same boat. If we got COVID, we would probably go and get tested, or we were required to get mandatory testing. So if we actually had COVID, that would be picked up. At this point, who is actually getting tested? You see the vast multitude of people not walking around with masks anymore. You don't see the lines at the countertops at the pharmacies to get tested anymore. So who is actually getting tested? Because when they look at the percentage of people that are going for tests and the people that are actually testing positive, it's probably going to be very close to 100% of all people that are going to get tested show up with COVID at this point. Think about that. How is that going to impact the reporting of the numbers? Oh, 100%, rate of people contracting COVID who are exposed. That's how they're going to play the numbers. So anyway, just a few things to think about. Of course, we should pray for our leaders. We should pray for Joe Biden that the impact is not bad. According to the news report, the symptoms are mild. And according to the news report, Joe Biden did not show up positive. We shall see. Of course, they are vacationing in Rehoboth because Joe Biden's been in a perpetual state of vacation for a while now. Anyway, that's all I've got. Hope you have a wonderful day. Take care. God bless.